When you first pick up the Iliad, you may be wondering, before I begin, am I about to read history or am I about to read mythology? And if it's history, was there a historical Troy? Was there a historical Trojan War? If so, when did it happen? And did it happen like it's represented in the Iliad? When you think of ancient Greece, you probably think of the classical period. That is the period of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, of the Parthenon, the big columns, the Spartan hoplites, and the Athenians fighting off the Persian invasion. That culminated with the rise of Alexander the Great and his expansion across the known world as far as India, taking Greek culture with them. And then later, after his death, his kingdoms being divided up and eventually conquered by the Romans at the beginning of the Roman Empire. That's all much later than the composition of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the composition of the Iliad and the Odyssey is happening much later than the events that they describe. So if we back up from the classical period back to around the year 800, sometime between 800 and 720, 730 BCE, that's when the Iliad and the Odyssey are being composed by potentially an actual person named Homer, or maybe that name just refers to some group of people over time. But either way, this is when we can tell from the language and from later historical accounts that this is when the Iliad and the Odyssey were being composed. The time they're describing, the Trojan War, even the ancient Greeks placed that sometime between 1200 and 1100 BCE. They didn't have those years, but they would their calculation translates to around the year we would call 1200. And it turns out there was an era, an age of collapse. The great Bronze Age empires, like the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Hittite empires, as well as the Mycenaean empires, they all faced some sort of cataclysm. Now, there was actually a Troy. There still is a Troy. Nobody lives there except maybe the archaeologists who work there, but you can visit it. It's in a place called Hisarlik on the western coast of modern-day Turkey. Troy was located at a place that was very advantageous to two different empires. That is the Mycenaean Empire, which is mostly like naval maritime empire composed of islands and kingdoms on the area of mainland Greece. But it's also close and connected by land to the Hittite Empire. Notice the Hittite Empire there is in the modern nation of Turkey. The Turks had not arrived at this point, so in ancient times they referred to this whole peninsula as Anatolia. The Mycenaean Empire, on the other hand, is much more consists of these islands from Crete in the south to the Greek Peloponnese in the north, and part of what they probably would have considered their territory was the western coast of Anatolia. Although the Hittites may have also considered that their territory. So you can see how the Mycenaeans and the Hittites might have come into conflict over some of these areas. And it's very likely that Troy was one of those areas. The Mycenaean Empire is a name that we, in our time, we've given to this past empire. That is because it is clearly located centrally. It is ruled over from this city of Mycenae. And just like Hisarlik, you can visit Troy. You can also visit Mycenae if you go to Greece. I did a long time ago, and had these notions about this gigantic ancient kingdom, and it is very impressive. There are very big stone walls you can visit at Mycenae, but as you can see, that gate is not quite megalithic. It's not going to allow any giants to pass through without bending down. So I could probably jump and touch the upper part of that gate. But still, for the time, very impressive that such construction was built in the first place, but also has survived until the present day. So we call this empire the Mycenaeans. We might also, in modern terms, describe them as Greek. They will be described as Greek in the Emily Wilson translation of the Iliad that I'll be using for the most part. But the word Greek doesn't appear. No version of it appears in the Iliad. By the way, the Greeks today don't refer to themselves as Greeks. They're called their nation Hellas. But in the Iliad, they're going to describe themselves usually by three names. One is Achaean, the other is Danaan, the other is Argive. But these are all part of this consortium, this confederation of groups, and that we today describe as the Mycenaeans. Now, this word Achaean Doesn't get used very much in Homer's time or after, but he remembers it from some sort of from the past, from before this Greek Dark Age. And that word shows up in the writing produced by the Hittites. The Hittite Empire, that was probably at war with the Achaeans more often than not, they describe them as the Ahiyawa. They use this term in their cuneiform writings, or the Hiyawa. The Egyptians describe them as the Ekwesh. And in both languages, if you sort of took the name Achaean and you pronounced it the way the people in those two empires pronounced it, you would get either Ahiyawa in the Hittite or Ekwesh in the Egyptian. Sometimes they are referred to as Danaans in the Iliad, and this corresponds to a word used by the Egyptians, which is Danuna. You'll also hear them described as Argives, and that is anybody from Argos. Now, the problem with Argos is it's both a city and a very large region, so it could refer to either of those. But you'll see that Diomedes is from Argos, and most of the other kings in the Iliad, or the other Greeks in the Iliad, are not from that city of Argos, but they are still described as Argives, meaning they're from the larger area of Argos. You'll see that it's not just Agamemnon ruling over everybody else, but in history, as in the Iliad, there was this sort of confederation with Mycenae and the king of Mycenae being the most powerful, but these other guys are kings as well. And just like Achilles, there are going to be kings that say, hey, hang on, I don't follow orders from you. I can pick up and leave anytime I want. You know, we are a loose confederation, and we reserve the right to make our own decisions. The Mycenaeans did have their own writing system before the Bronze Age collapse. That was Linear B, but that is only barely remembered in the Iliad. So during that Greek Dark Ages, it's like the Greeks completely forgot about writing, although there is this echo of the use of a writing on a tablet that will come across in the Iliad. The Mycenaeans traded with the Egyptians, the Phoenicians. They traded as far as the Empire of Babylon. With their neighbors, the Hittites, we don't see Mycenaean goods ending up there as much as we do with Egypt or with the Phoenicians or with the Babylonians. And we don't see Hittite goods ending up in Mycenae quite as much. It seems to be that they didn't like each other, and that went as far as like refusing to trade with each other. We even have a written text from the Hittites where the king of the Hittites tries to tell people in the Assyrian Empire, don't trade with the Mycenaeans. During the Bronze Age, most of the wealth wasn't located in either in Egypt or in Babylon or one of these other areas. The wealth was constantly moving. A thriving economy is an economy that's, you know, on the move. That is, people are trading back and forth, and when you're trading with someone, you don't usually want to fight them. We'll see that a lot of the wealth depended on this trade network, and once that trade network broke down, most of these kingdoms are going to either disappear or decline. The Trojans, unlike the Mycenaeans, the Trojans aren't their own empire. They seem to have been loosely connected with the Hittite Empire, but only loosely. The city is remembered in Greek as Ilios. This is where we get the word Iliad for the name of the epic. But it's connected to the Hittite word Wilusa, or Wilusia. As I mentioned, it's located in what is modern-day Turkey, but in ancient times this was known as Anatolia. Sometimes it's described as Asia Minor because the people who lived there were called the Ashua. That is the sort of ethnic group. Not the city is Troy, but the people in that area are usually remembered as the Ashua. This is where we get the word Asia. Keep in mind, just like the Greeks don't call themselves Greeks, most people in the continent of Asia don't call themselves Asian unless they're talking to a Westerner. That's because this word comes from the very western tip of the very western tip of the continent of Asia. In fact, Turkey today is usually considered more part of Europe than it is part of Asia. Even if you consider part of the Middle East, it is the original Asia. The name of this people, Ashua, is where we get the word Asia. So this is why this area is called Asia Minor. The peninsula, at the end of Anatolian Peninsula is sometimes called the Troad. So it seems that the word Troy more referred to the land around the city rather than the city itself. Although obviously in the Iliad we're going to have it describing the city. It is very fortuitously located. Well, I guess it depends. But you can see these straits that connect the Aegean Sea and that go northeast. They're going to connect, in the end, they're going to connect the Mediterranean Sea through the Aegean to the Black Sea. That is another, the next biggest sea in the area. And if you're a merchant or if you're trying to set up colonies for your empire, you're going to want to be able to get from one sea to the other. And notice Troy is very well located. It's right at the end of what's called the Hellespont. That's after Hellas in Greek, or the Dardanelles, which, the Trojans are also known as the Dardans. So depending on whose side you're on, you'll call it the Hellespont or the Dardanelles. But that strait is where merchants and others have to go through to get from the Aegean and the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. And it might be that the Trojans were charging some sort of tax for ships that go through there. More than likely, as we're going to see, Troy is described as windy Troy. The wind there gets referred to a lot. That is because the winds, back in the days before motors, you had to depend on the wind in order to get your ship from one place to another. You could travel very quickly across the sea, much faster than you could across land, as long as the winds were on your side. Now you might be thinking, couldn't they use oars? Not over the long haul, not for a long distance movement. But especially when you're trying to navigate an area where your ship could get beached or run up against the rocks, you needed the wind to be going the right direction in order for you to move. So a lot of people probably ended up beached at Troy. You notice it's part of a harbor now that no longer exists, but this little bay you see at the southern end of the Hellespont would be a great place to beach your ships while you waited for the winds to change where you wanted to. And hey, while you're here, you're going to need to pick up something to eat. You're going to need supplies, maybe resupply, maybe even trade some of the stuff that you've been bringing from Egypt or from Phoenicia. Maybe you want to go ahead and trade with some representatives of the Hittite Empire who traveled over land. Well, all that's going to happen at Troy, which means Troy is going to be very wealthy. Whether they're charging taxes for merchants or whether they're just there to do business when people are stuck because of the winds, that's going to be a very wealthy spot. Now, that is the reason for Troy's success. Might also be the reason that the Mycenaeans, the Greeks, the Achaeans wanted to conquer it. Okay, so there were real Achaeans, real Greeks at the time. There were real Trojans. There's a real Troy. Did the Greeks and the Trojans fight? Did the Mycenaeans actually try to take that city of Troy because it was wealthy or because Helen was taken there or whatever? Well, historically, here's what we can say. Yes, the Mycenaeans did do some fighting at Troy. Was it one point? No, actually it happens several times over. And it's not really clear all the time when they're fighting, when they're there fighting, maybe not against the Trojans. There was an Asuo rebellion, that is the Asian rebellion. The people of Troy fought against the Hittites from 1430 to 1420. And during that time, a sword from the Mycenaeans, a Mycenaean style sword that was not made outside of Mycenae, turns up the Hittite Empire in Hattusha, the capital of the Hittites. And it is inscribed saying that it was captured from the enemy and is being dedicated to the storm god by the king of the Hittites to commemorate his victory over the Asuo rebellion. So basically what happened was the Trojans revolted against the Hittites, and somebody fighting alongside the Trojans was using a Mycenaean sword. How did that Mycenaean sword get there? Was it a Mycenaean mercenary? Were the Mycenaeans at large actually trying to help Troy separate from the Hittites so that they could have more influence over Mycenae? We don't know. There was an earthquake that struck Troy around 1300. This is going to end one sort of era of building and civilization in Troy and mark the sort of rebuilding will mark a new era at Troy. Then around 1280, the Hittites have to go help the Trojans and their king Alexander, not to be confused with Alexander the Great. He's not going to be born for another 1,000 years. But this king at the time named Alexander needed the Hittites' help, and they send help, but then they turn and the Hittites themselves actually defeat Alexander, and they turn against Troy. Then between 1267 and 1237, there is some kind of fighting going on between the Ahiyawa, that is the Achaeans, and the Trojans at Wilusa, at least this is according to the Hittite text. Troy is then attacked by a foreign enemy sometime between 1237 and 1209. The Hittites come to help them out. Was that foreign enemy the Mycenaeans? We don't know. Troy is again attacked and destroyed, at least the lower part of the city is destroyed, sometime between 1190 and 1180. It's at this time we're going to find, the archaeologists have found arrowheads, unburied bodies, or at least bodies that were buried very hastily, so not very deep, which is the kind of thing you don't do when you're rebuilding. It's the kind of thing you do when you're kind of giving up that area, when you're sort of moving out and nobody's going to be taking over there. And then between 1186 and 1177, we have a group that is called by the Egyptians, they're referred to as the Sea Peoples. And this isn't just one group, this is people from all over the Western Mediterranean. But the Egyptian texts that describe these Sea Peoples include the Danuna, which is the Danaans, that is the Mycenaeans. They attack Egypt after having attacked some other cities, including Mycenaean cities like the city of Pylos. Or it is possible that the groups being described as the sea people, some of them were attacking others of them, and then there was retaliation. But this group was destroying cities all over the Mediterranean, as we'll see in a minute, and it was pretty much the end of the Bronze Age. Troy would continue to be a little bit occupied until about 1100, when there was either an earthquake or an attack, and then it was abandoned from that time for centuries, at least beyond Homer's time. So this was the last time Troy had been occupied before the composition of the Iliad and the Odyssey around the year 800. Now, archaeologically, Troy is divided up into different eras of its existence, and it's kind of hard to tell with archaeology because you're digging down from the most recent layers of buildings, and debris is going to be at the top, and then the next most recent is going to be below that, because whenever a city is destroyed, especially when it's an earthquake or a fire, what you do is you just sort of flatten out everything and build on top of it. But archaeologists have tried to pinpoint, okay, when was the Trojan War? Can we dig down to a particular level and say, okay, this is the time, these are the artifacts, the broken pottery, the arrowheads, the broken walls that were left over from the Trojan War as described in the Iliad? Well, no, we can't. We can find a couple of areas, sometimes described as Troy 6, Troy 6H, because these 9 different eras of Troy, they're themselves divided up, but they try to mark when the city was thriving. So the idea is Troy 6 was, doing fine until some destructive event, then it was destroyed, then Troy 7 was built on top of it. But turns out it's not quite that simple. As you can see from the picture on the bottom right, there is a citadel that is at the very top of this hill, but then down below it there's a larger city, and that city has a wall around it. Well, around 1190, there was a siege of Troy that resulted in the destruction of the lower city. This is where we have archaeologists have found arrowheads, as well as piles of sling stones. That is the kind of little stone that you would put in a sling, like a slingshot, to spin it around and send it at very high velocity, almost like a bullet, at the time. But it's not the kind of thing that you usually use as your first line of defense. This is indication that the local townspeople were just using whatever they had available to fight some sort of invader. And this is the time at which we also have bodies that are either not buried or just barely buried. And but this is all in the lower town. It seems that after this destruction, this invasion, everybody moved up to the upper city, and so all of a sudden you have the upper city being even more occupied than it was before, while the lower city was just completely abandoned. Was this the Trojan War? Well, we don't know. But by 1177, it's not just Troy that's been destroyed. Cities like Pylos, which is where King Nestor is from in the Iliad. Mycenae, the capital of the Mycenaean Empire. Hattusha, the capital of the Hittite Empire. All of these cities are in ruins by 1177. The Hittite Empire is gone, the Mycenaean Empire is gone. Only Egypt remains, and it's much weaker than it was before. And this too, we seem to have some echo, some memory in the Iliad when Hera, the queen of the gods and the wife of Zeus, tells Zeus, who loves Troy, she wants to destroy Troy, and she wants to destroy it so bad, even though he loves it, she's willing to trade and say, like, I love 3 cities by far most of all. Mycenae, with its spacious streets. Menelaum, which in the Emily Wilson translation, she calls it Sparta. Sparta doesn't technically exist yet, but it's that. The Menelaean is the largest city in that Lacedaemon, that area. But that is the city ruled over by Menelaus. She loves that. She loves Mycenae, and she loves Argos, a city that's just south of Mycenae. But she is willing to let Zeus destroy all of them. She says, I will not stand up for them or grudge you this. Anytime you start to hate them, destroy them. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Sometime after the fall of Troy, we're going to have the fall of Mycenae, the fall of Hattusha, the fall of Pylos, the fall of Menelaus, and the fall of Argos. So how much of this does Homer know? We have 3 centuries passing between the fall of the Bronze Age collapse, 3 centuries at least of the Greek Dark Ages, and then after that we have Homer composing the Iliad and the Odyssey. How much of what's in the Iliad actually describes what actually happened? It's hard to say, but this is going to be more of an exercise than an answer. answering this question is going to sort of help us focus and help us find new interesting pieces and new perspectives on the things we read in the Iliad. During this Greek Dark Age, we don't have any writing, we don't have any building, we don't have any cultural artifacts, but that doesn't mean that culture just disappeared. People didn't just disappear. And when people are rebuilding, or even if in a much smaller scale than what they're used to, they remember this sort of past golden age, or in this case, Bronze Age. They remember that there were these great big empires. We used to get all this stuff from trade from people far away. We used to have all this technology. Everything used to be better, but then something happened. Well, what happened is going to be remembered through stories. Those stories may not be accurate. They're going to be very limited in perspective, but they are based on something. And you're not just going to have one story. Everybody has a different version of what happened. People are living in different areas. They're witnessing different things. But as they tell people who tell people who tell people, we're going to have some piece of information, however much changed, artistically altered, passed on through these centuries. And one of the ways that these were passed on were through oral poems. That is, epics and other stories weren't just being told, they were being sung. They were put to music, they were put in a meter, so that these traveling bards, these traveling poets, like potentially what we assume Homer was, but even before him, there were a lot of these other people singing these stories, and they would each tell different pieces of it. And this seems to have been what is the sort of the glass through which we were trying to view what happened before the Greek Dark Ages. So they carried these stories, at least pieces of the stories. Probably nobody had like the entire Iliad, much less the entire story of the Trojan War. But there would be stories about Paris and Helen. There would be stories about Odysseus trying to get home. Maybe even parts of those stories. There would be stories about Achilles, about Ajax, about other heroes that will later get combined, or at least be part of this larger backstory that is carried to us in the Iliad and other texts. And Homer, whether, we don't know exactly if somebody by this name lived and he was the one who composed the Iliad beginning to end, or if this is just sort of a name, a mythologized version, a story about the story. But it seems to be that whoever this was during the 8th century BC, this person was taking all of these stories that had been passed on for centuries and combining them. So if something happened during the Bronze Age collapse, some war like the Trojan War, and stories of it survived even in fragmented or slightly altered form, to be part of the story of the Trojan War as it's narrated in the Iliad. Okay, well, which one was it? Is the Trojan, are the Achaeans, are they the sea peoples that attacked in 1177? Are they the people that the Trojans fought with in 1190 to 1180, and when they had to abandon the lower city, but then they continued to live in the upper part of the city? Were they the foreign enemy that the Hittites had to protect the Trojans from? Well, it's possible that all of these provided pieces of a story that got combined later on. It's possible that there wasn't one Trojan War, but lots of Trojan Wars between Mycenaeans and Trojans, or maybe Mycenaeans and Hittites that were just battles that were fought at the city of Troy. And so instead of saying, okay, which of these is the reason the Trojan Wars fought, which of these characters were real historical characters, let's step back and say, okay, in a story, we have a lot more than just facts being described. We have explanations about why things happened, about what people were thinking, what people wanted, what people were responding to. All the interpretations of cause and effect require a little bit of addition that goes beyond what the facts themselves tell us. So what did they actually see? What sort of actual events would have been part, like the origin of the story that was then added to? And a good example of this way of thinking is if we look at the myths of the Cyclops. You may have heard this one before, but across Europe, there are the remains, the fossilized remains of past elephantids, things like mammoths, mastodons, even like pygmy elves, and different parts, even in some islands in the Mediterranean. Especially during the Bronze Age and during the Greek Dark Ages, nobody would have seen an actual elephant. There were no elephants north of Africa or west of India at that time. People may have heard stories about elephants, but if they dug up a skull like this, a fossil skull like this, they would probably not immediately think, okay, that's an elephant. They would be actually kind of hard-pressed to figure out exactly what it was. The skull would be pretty huge, they would not have seen an elephant skull. So they might be thinking along the lines of, okay, I know what a human skull looks like. I know, okay, there's a jaw, just like the human jaw. There's the, the cranium, just like a human skull. But then instead of like two eyes and a nose, I see what looks like a nose hole, but above it is just one big gap where there should be two eye sockets. There's just one. Now on an elephant, that is the actual nasal passage. The opening below it in its ancestors may have been the nasal passage, but it's closed when the actual elephant is alive. There's cartilage and muscle attached there that helps move the trunk. But the nasal passage is actually the part that is between the eyes. And you might not even notice that there are eye sockets on the skull, but they're on the side. So if you looked at that and you didn't know what an elephant was, the logical conclusion you would make is this looks like a human skull, except that there's only one eye socket. And it's most likely from this that we get early stories about the Cyclops. Now, if you saw that skull close to large ribs and large arm bones and leg bones, you might sort of put the thing together, at least mentally in your mind, and say, okay, this thing stood very, very tall. And, if you've noticed that the feet, elephant feet actually do look like fingers, it looks like they have fingers, even though when they're, covered with skin and bone or skin and muscle, it doesn't. It looks like just like the trunk of a tree. But the bones themselves do look like fingers. So just going on those bones, you might think, okay, this makes sense. This was this giant humanoid-like creature that stood up on its back legs, but it just had one eye. That would be the main difference. It's huge, and it has one eye. So by focusing on what they saw, and we take away the explanation, and just look at the facts, we can see where the explanation would have come from. Another example of this type of thinking is if you look at a lot of stories about gods fighting giants, fighting monsters, there's usually some sort of like dust coming up from the horizon that goes up into the sky, and then the sky god, whether it's Zeus or in Greek mythology or other storm gods and other mythologies, the sky god responds by throwing lightning, and sometimes there's something burning either in the sky or on the ground or both, like in this account from Hesiod's Theogony, which was written very close to the time that the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed, slightly after Homer's time. But Hesiod describes Zeus as fighting against the Titans by hurling lightning, whirling an awesome flame. The life-giving earth crashed around in burning, and the vast wood cracked loud with fire all about. In other words, the woods are bursting into fire. Lightning's being thrown. All the land seethed, and the ocean streams and the unfruitful sea. The hot vapor lapped round the earthborn Titans. Flame unspeakable rose into the bright air. So the oceans are boiling. The forests are burning. Astounding heat seized chaos, as if earth and wide heaven above came together. A mighty crash, and heaven from on high were hurling her down, were hurling the earth down. The rumbling earthquake and dust storms. All of this description is in a story about a storm god fighting against Titans. But if we just think about, okay, not the explanation, not the characters, but if we just look at what's being described, that's pretty much how a volcano looks. The rising heat actually creates a lightning storm because it's passing through the much colder air. We can see how dust clouds are coming up, and even entire chunks of earth are being thrown into the air and then crashing back down again. So if we just strip away the explanation for an event like this and just look at what would have caused this fire, this lightning, this storm cloud, this dust cloud rising up from the earth, we have a more logical, more realistic explanation that would not have been available to people thousands of years ago who didn't know how lightning was formed or who didn't know what an elephant was. So we have to remember that the human brain can't stand to just look at facts and not add inferences to them. We see something in reality, we want to explain it. How did that happen? Where did that come from? What does it indicate about the future? I need to connect what is unfamiliar to what is familiar to me. So if I don't know what an elephant is, I'm going to add this explanation when I see that skull that says, okay, this is a humanoid thing, but it's huge and it has one eye. If I see a volcano, I can't just say that this is this sort of fissure in the Earth's crust. I can't explain like tectonic phenomena, much less how the superheated air creates lightning storms. All I can do is say there is a character, a personality, like a storm god, like Zeus, who is throwing lightning at this earth god or titan that is using fire and throwing entire chunks of earth up into the air. I'm going to explain the unfamiliar by resorting to familiar explanations, familiar schema. I'll come to that term in the next lecture. But we can look back at these accounts, even though we can't see the thing they're describing, we can look back at the accounts and say, okay, maybe this seems to be describing certain facts that, if we take the explanation away, make a lot more sense if we attach them to a different explanation. That becomes even more complicated when we're talking about centuries passing. One person telling somebody else about a cyclops. The person who sees the elephant skull can't say this is an elephant skull because they don't know what an elephant is. All they can say is, I saw this giant skull with one eye. It seemed to be part of this giant that they're assuming is human. So the person who hears that story, they don't have any other. They get the explanation before they even get a description of what the facts are. So if Homer is the recipient, not necessarily of the Cyclops story, although obviously that's going to, Polyphemus might actually be both, a Cyclops and a volcano story, because he's located on the island of Sicily, where Mount Etna is, a famously active volcano. But in the Iliad, Homer is hearing a story with a lot of interpretations from somebody who heard a story with a lot of interpretations from somebody who heard a story with a lot of interpretations, going back at least 3 centuries or more to the Trojan War or wars. So is there anything there that matches up, that makes sense? How much of this could be accurate? Well, actually, there are some indications. There are some descriptions of things that actually do match what archaeologists have found. Well, in the Iliad, Patroclus is going to enter the battlefield, and he's going to start winning victories against the Trojans. He's going to push the Trojans all the way back to the walls of Troy, and not satisfied, he's going to try to climb the walls of Troy 3 times. The only reason he fails is because the god Apollo knocks him down each time. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. How are you going to climb a castle wall? Well, archaeologists who were digging at the walls of Troy 6 noticed that the walls are actually kind of sloped. They didn't have the technology to build straight up without making it weak, because they weren't able to pack the rocks together tightly fitting enough, or use the right kind of mortar to make it secure. Which is also why there's these big gaps between the rocks, between the bricks. So you have this giant wall, but it's leaning, and there are big enough cracks between the individual bricks that you're able to get a handhold in. That might explain why Patroclus is able to climb up the wall, but Homer doesn't tell us what the wall looked like. All he tells us is, in the story that he's heard or he's passing on, Patroclus was able to climb the wall. We'll see when Andromache, the wife of Hector, tries to convince him to stay and guard the walls of Troy rather than going out on the battlefield. She tells him there's a weak point on the western edge near this fig tree. Well, it turns out that the western wall had a hill, so they try to keep the top of the wall level, but the hill is actually on an incline, and so there's actually the shortest distance to climb the wall would be on the western edge. That too might be something that Homer would be unlikely to know from visiting the place, since it was probably already buried by rubble and debris and rebuilding since then. If you've ever heard someone try to debunk the Viking horned helmet myth, you've probably heard that you'd have to be an idiot to put horns on your helmet. You're basically just giving your enemy another way to kill you. That is, you can grab the helmet by the horns and break the guy's neck. This is why you can't grab a face mask in football. So it would make no sense for horns to be put on helmets. Well, there's a description of Paris's helmet in Book 4. When Paris fights against Menelaus, Menelaus goes to hit Paris with his sword, but he strikes his helmet and he hits what the Emily Wilson translation is going to describe as an ornament on the helmet. But it's actually the word for horn. But people for a long time said, okay, that must just mean, it can't be a horn, it must be just some sort of decoration. But we do have indications from this, what's called the warrior vase. This is a vase, a painted vase from the area of Mycenae from around the year 1200, around the time of the Trojan Wars, that depicts soldiers with a large crest on top of the helmet and with horns on the front. So it is very likely that what Homer's describing, which is something that is not, soldiers don't wear helmets like that in Homer's time, in the Iron Age. But it seems from this vase and other indications that centuries before that, they actually did wear those. So he's got the story right. He may not know why it's right, but it seems that he's passing on descriptions of past modes of armor. Another really interesting ones, and we'll have several of these, but when he describes Odysseus in Book 10 as being given a helmet made of boar's tusks, that might be kind of hard to imagine, and for a long time it did. It didn't make any sense. How could you make a helmet out of boar's tusks? Well, turns out, since or over the past century, archaeologists have found examples of people being buried with these, basically a felt hat that has these boar's tusks attached to it. And we even have carvings of those boar's tusks that indicate what it looked like when it was all put together. So here again, this is not the type of armor that anybody in Homer's time would have been familiar with, but by passing the story along, he passed along a description of something that we now know actually did exist. As I mentioned, Troy at several points had been hit by an earthquake. We don't have this in Homer, at least not as explicitly as this, but centuries later, when Virgil writes the Aeneid, he still has access to some of the texts of the epic cycle, which I'll talk about in the next lecture. But it seems that he's describing a scene that may have some grounding in history as well. When Aeneas is telling the story about watching Troy being destroyed as he's trying to escape, keep in mind Aeneas is a Trojan prince, before he escapes, he sees his mother, Aphrodite, shows him that the gods are also destroying the city. It's not just the Greeks attacking it. He says, there where you see the massive, Aphrodite, or Venus in Latin, is telling her son Aeneas, there, look where you see the massive rampart shattered, blocks wrenched from blocks, and the billowing smoke and ash. It's Neptune, that is Poseidon, himself, prying loose with his giant trident the foundation stones of Troy. He's making the walls quake, ripping up the entire city by her roots. So Poseidon is the earth shaker. You'll see him described a lot in the Iliad as the earth shaker. He is the god of earthquakes, not just the god of the sea, but he's also the god of horses and of earthquakes. And he is being described as one of the forces destroying Troy. So as I mentioned, Troy was hit at least a couple of times by an earthquake. And if you're an invading army, that would be the perfect time to attack a city that's protected by walls, is when an earthquake has damaged those walls to some degree. So this could be some indication, an observation, an eyewitness observation that is encoded in story and then passed along, that survives in Homer. There are also the potential for larger, more abstract cultural phenomena, like why is it that Athena is so dead set on destroying Troy? Why is it that Aphrodite is the patroness who's especially protecting Paris? Well, there is an explanation within the story of the Trojan War. But it also seems to reflect a larger sort of cultural phenomenon where Athena was the patron goddess of the Mycenaean Empire. This is why the city of Athens is named after her. This is why she's always defending the Greeks in the Iliad, in the Odyssey, and pretty much all other Greek literature. But it's Aphrodite who is supporting Paris. She's the one who tells Paris, go to Greece, go to Mycenae, or actually Lacedaemon, which is later Sparta, where Menelaus and Helen live, and take Helen. And when he does, he actually builds a fleet, and he goes to Sparta. He gets Helen, then he goes and raids several other cities. Well, Aphrodite is a Greek adaptation of a goddess from other cultures, namely from the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians got this goddess, seemed to be transmitting stories about a goddess named Astarte, who comes from the goddess Ishtar as far away as Mesopotamia, that is Babylon. And you can sort of chart out this evolution of Inanna or Ishtar in the Epic of Gilgamesh becomes Astarte along the coast of the Levant, and then she moves from there to the island of Cyprus when the Phoenicians settle Cyprus. But the Greeks find her, and they actually, in the stories, Aphrodite is actually born on Cyprus, and from Cyprus she's adopted into the Greek pantheon as Aphrodite. So if there's this Phoenician goddess who is making a play for the city of Troy and trying to get the Trojans to go to war and actually attack Mycenaeans, where Athena is protecting them, then culturally, if these two goddesses represent two cultures, and incidentally, these two cultures will continue to divide up the Mediterranean between them for another millennium at least, the if you see a map, if you look up a map of the Phoenician settlements in the Mediterranean, you'll see they go as far as Spain. The city of Carthage in Libya is a Phoenician settlement, whereas the next most common cultural sites are going to be from the Greeks, that is the people of Athena. So Aphrodite and Athena are sort of starting their competition to divide up the Mediterranean coastal towns between the Greeks and the Phoenicians. Now, that's speculative. Is this what the competition between Athena and Aphrodite really represents? Maybe, maybe not. That much is abstract enough that we can sort of see these correlations, but we don't actually know that this is what's going on. And so back to the question of, well, if we have all these individual elements, which one is the actual Trojan War? And to answer that, we have to think not about history, not about the evidence from each individual site, each individual time period, but we have to think about the way the human brain works. When you hear a story, the further back in time something happened, the more likely we are to sort of confuse how much time existed between one event and another. If the picture on the top right makes sense, okay, Galileo was a famous, an early modern scientist, as was Benjamin Franklin. If I could imagine Galileo showing Benjamin Franklin how to use a telescope, that kind of makes sense. They both seem to have lived in this sort of distant past, but they actually lived quite a distance apart. This is called temporal compression. Sometimes it's called telescoping, although in psychology the word telescoping is used in a much more specific way. More often than not in history and in archaeology you hear the word telescoping used this way. But something that is far away doesn't, we don't always accurately estimate how far back in time it may have been. And especially when we have different events happening at different times, we might tend to compress the time between them in our minds when we try to remember them. Now, if I asked you, how much time separated the COVID-19 pandemic from the World Trade Center attacks on 9/11, you're probably going to know it's something around 20 years. It's 19 years, but okay, that kind of makes sense. It seems like 20 years separated those two things. But if I asked you how much time separated the Salem witch trials from the arrival of the Mayflower in the New World, that might seem, I don't know, that wasn't the same time. I guess the Salem witch trials, people were already here. I don't know, maybe 20 years seems realistic when it was actually 72 years. Or the explorers of the New World, how much time separated Henry Hudson exploring Hudson Bay and the Hudson River, how late after the time when Amerigo Vespucci charted the Amazon. That might seem like, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, but that was 110 years. How much time separated Julius Caesar from Alexander the Great? Again, if you're not familiar on the things that happened around that time, that might seem like that could be 20 years, that could be 50 years, when it's actually 279 years. That is from the death of Alexander the Great to the death of Julius Caesar, 279 years. But most people think it may have been closer to like 50, maybe 100, but still a great compression of the assumed time that happened between these two things. You'll see this happen in art. The image on the right is very common. Paintings from the Middle Ages and from the Renaissance very frequently have depictions of Jesus being persecuted by Roman soldiers, and the Roman soldiers are wearing whatever armor was being worn by soldiers at the time. So in this case, this is from the 1600s, so this guy's got a full coat of armor. It happens still today. If you watch a TV show or a movie, you're probably going to see a whole lot of things that happen centuries apart, or at least decades apart. One of my pet peeves was the show I really wanted to like, the TV show Vikings, that had Rollo, or Rolf the Ganger, the walker, the founder of Normandy, was like a brother or cousin of Ragnar Lodbrok. Well, both of them were involved in sieges of Paris, but they were separated by decades. At most, their lives may have overlapped by about 15 years, but still, it makes a good story if we just have them be the same age doing the same thing at the same time. These are examples of temporal compression. Probably, if we go back even further in time, if you ever see depictions of cavemen and dinosaurs living at the same time, obviously, there were no mammals around during the age of the dinosaurs, much less humans. that part you might know, but if you see depictions like in Disney's Fantasia of a Tyrannosaurus Rex trying to fight a Stegosaurus, you might think, okay, the Stegosaurus had to evolve to keep the Tyrannosaurus Rex from biting its back. Well, those two were separated by about 80 million years. The Stegosaurus was around from about 155 to 150 million years ago, the late Jurassic, whereas the Tyrannosaurus Rex didn't come along until about 68,000 years ago, that is the late Cretaceous. Not a big deal. You know, we don't have to worry about seeing the two in the same place at the same time, but that's just how much, the further back we go in time, the more we tend to like just assume everything happened all at once rather than realize these things were separated out. So if you're having a hard time doing this, imagine somebody telling that story when we think about the facts versus the interpretations added to them, when we think about how the facts that we do remember get compressed, get sort of smushed together, and we forget the fact that they were all very distinct from each other. This can shape the way stories are composed, and obviously once the story is composed, that is what gets remembered. It's not the original distinctions, it's not the original facts that get remembered. That said, it still makes the Iliad a very interesting object of study, because once we start to realize, oh, this actually is referring to something that matches archaeological findings, this is actually something that matches something else that we can prove, that is not the only reason to read the Iliad by any means, but it does make the experience of it much richer. When we can read the same text that people have been reading for almost 3,000 years now and find some new evidence, some new truth in it, then that makes it all the more interesting.